This is Tennis for Two. Developed in 1958 at a nuclear research lab, it is one of the oldest video games ever created. There is no graphics card here, no RAM, no code as we know it today. It's an analog computer using vacuum tubes and transistors to calculate the physics of a missile's trajectory, just to let two people hit a ball back and forth. And this is a video game in 2026, almost 70 years later. To run this on its highest setting, you need roughly 1 million times the computing power used to send the Apollo 11 mission to the moon.
We have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Honestly, if you scale it out, it's a miracle we taught rocks how to play video games at all. We took sand, etched it with billions of microscopic switches, and gave it enough power to simulate the behavior of life itself. But to understand how we reached the peak of realism, we have to go back where rocks could barely count to 8. This is the evolution of video game graphics. Let's start in 1972. Not in your living room, because you didn't have this in your living room. You had to go somewhere. You had to make a pilgrimage. The arcade wasn't just a place to play games. It was the only place that you could play them at all. And these weren't toys, they were machines, massive industrial heat generating circuit boards that weighed hundreds of pounds and required constant maintenance. And each one was built with one purpose: to eat your quarters. This is Pong. Released by Atari in 1972, it became the first commercially successful video game. It is also absurdly simple: 2 paddles, 1 ball, a dotted line down the middle. But here's what's wild. Inside of this cabinet, there's no CPU, there's no software, there's no code being executed. This machine is hardwired. Every pixel, every movement, every bounce of that square ball is controlled by a web of transistors and logic gates soldered directly onto the board. To change the game, you have to physically rewire the machine. You couldn't patch it, you couldn't update it. The game was the hardware.
And then you have this up here. It says, let's read it. Adjustment procedure for Pong video game. This machine has been fully tested and adjusted prior to leaving the factory. It has been designed to be as maintenance free as possible. An effort has been made to reduce the heat generated by the machine to increase the lifetime of the components. The following adjustments can be made if the operator feels they are needed. The contrast, brightness, volume, horizontal, and vertical hold controls on a television set still operate as in a normal TV, and I had to adjust all of them.
In 1965, a man named Gordon Moore made a prediction. He said that the number of transistors you could fit in a chip would double roughly every 2 years. At the time, people thought he was being optimistic, but turns out he was being pretty conservative. By the mid-1970s, engineers had figured out how to cram more and more transistors into silicon wafers. The more transistors meant more logic. More logic meant more complexity, and more complexity meant that you could finally do something Pong couldn't do: move things independently. This is Space Invaders, 1978. And it changed everything. For the first time, you had multiple objects on screen that could move independently. These weren't just geometric shapes bouncing around, they were sprites, little blocks of pixel data that the computer could track, move, and animate separately from the background. The cabinet ran on an Intel 8080 processor, a chip clocked at about 2 megahertz. For context, that's 2 million cycles per second. But your smartphone, it's running at about 3,000 megahertz, or 1,500 times faster per core, and it probably has 8 cores, so you do the math. In 1978, 2 megahertz was enough to render 55 aliens, track their position, animate their movement, handle collision detection, play sound effects, and keep score all in real time. Okay, so let's talk about data. Space Invaders back in took about 5 kilobytes of space.
You need to leave.
Just to put that in perspective, a single blank email today is about 4 kilobytes. A low resolution JPEG of your cat is probably 50, if that. The entire game could fit on a single text message that we send in modern times. And yet, this 8 kilobyte program generated over $2 billion in revenue and caused a national coin shortage in Japan. Another point is these machines were not efficient. A single cabinet could draw between 100 to 300 watts, about the same as running 3 to 4 incandescent light bulbs, and all that power generated heat. Arcade owners had to deal with ventilation issues, blown fuses, and machines that would literally overheat and crash during peak hours. The circuit boards ran hot to the touch, capacitors would blow, solder joints would crack and melt, and this is why arcades had to exist. The average person just couldn't afford to power the bill, let alone the space or the technical know-how to keep one of these things running. You had to centralize the technology. So the arcade wasn't just a business model, it was actually a necessity. The technology was too expensive, too power hungry, and too unstable to put in people's homes. A single Space Invader cabinet cost around $2,000 in 1978. That's like almost $10,000 in today's money. And for comparison, the median household income of the US at the time was like $15,000 a year. You couldn't afford to own this, but for 25 cents, you could rent 3 minutes of it.
You're watching the most exciting game you will ever see on your TV set. Telstar by Coleco with 3 different games. Telstar Tennis with digital scoring, variable speeds. Telstar Hockey. Each player controls a goalie plus a forward on the other side. Oops, a goal. And Telstar Singles Handball, a game you play yourself. Telstar Handball, Tennis, Hockey, all 3 at an exciting low price. For great family fun, hitch your TV to a Telstar.
By the end of the 70s, the thinking rock had learned to count. It could track dozens of objects, it could animate sprites, it could respond to your input in real time, but it still lived in a box that cost more than a used car. It still needed an electrician to install, and it still required a pilgrimage to experience. The question for the 80s was simple. Could we shrink the temple and bring it home?
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included. He helps you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or action-packed Hogan's Alley and high-flying Kung Fu, each sold separately? Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
This is 1985, and this is the future that almost didn't happen. Just 2 years earlier, the entire video game industry had collapsed, and in 1983, the market crashed so hard that stores were literally burying unsold cartridges in landfills. Atari, that company that started it all, lost over $500 million in a single year. People thought that video games were a fad, a novelty, something that would fade like CB radios and pet rocks. And then Nintendo released this little gray box, and everything changed. You've probably heard the term 8-bit thrown around a lot. Retro games, music, pixel art, nostalgia merchandise, but what does it actually mean? Inside the NES is a processor called the Rico 2A03, basically a modified version of the MOS technology 6502, the same chip that powered the Apple II and the Commodore 64. This chip is 8-bit, which means it can only process 8 bits of data at a time. Think of it like this. If a modern 64-bit processor can count from 0 to 18 quintillion on a single operation, an 8-bit processor can only count from 0 to 255. It's like trying to build a skyscraper using only Lego bricks that come in packs of 256. Because the NES could only process 8 bits at a time, it had severe limitations on what it could display. The system had a master palette of 52 colors, not 52 million, not 52,000, 52. And of those 52, the NES could only display 25 colors on screen at the same time. And that includes the background color. So you really only had 24 colors to work with your entire game. For comparison, a modern display can show over 16 million colors simultaneously, and the NES had 0.00015% of that. So how do you make a game with only 52 colors and 32 kilobytes of space? you get creative, you cheat, you become a master of efficiency. I mean, look at Super Mario Bros. See those clouds, see those bushes? They're the exact same sprite. The only difference is the color palette. Nintendo drew one graphic of puffy blob shape and colored it white for clouds and green for bushes. That's not laziness. I mean, it's genius. They say kilobytes of cartridge space, and because the NES had such limited memory, every single byte mattered. The entire game of Super Mario Bros., all the levels, all the enemies, all the music, all the code fit onto 32 kilobytes of ROM. That's 32,786 bytes. To put that in perspective, the image file of the Mona Lisa at standard resolution is about 2.5 megabytes. The Super Mario Bros. Is roughly 1/78th of a single JPEG of a painting. And yet, that 32 kilobyte cartridge contained 8 worlds, 32 levels, 13 different enemy types, multiple power-ups, and complete physics engines, and one of the most recognizable soundtracks in history. By 1989, something remarkable had happened. Kids were now carrying more computing power in their backpacks than NASA used to land humans on the moon. The Apollo guidance computer, the machine that calculated trajectories, managed life support, and guided the lunar module to the surface, had about 2 kilobytes of RAM and 72 kilobytes of ROM. The Game Boy, it had 8 kilobytes of RAM and up to 32 kilobytes of ROM per cartridge. It also had a custom CPU that could execute instructions faster than the Apollo computer. In just 20 years, we went from putting humans on another celestial body to putting that same level of technology in a plastic brick that ran on 4 AA batteries. The 1980s didn't just bring video games into the home, they democratized them. In the 70s, if you wanted to play a video game, you needed quarters and a ride to the arcade. You were limited by geography, by money, by time, availability. But now, you owned the machine. You could play for as long as you wanted. You could restart as many times as you wanted. The game lived in your house. The NES cost about $199 at launch in 1985, or close to $600 in today's money, which is less than a month's rent for most families. Expensive, yes, but kind of attainable. Unlike the arcade, you didn't even have to keep feeding it quarters. So how did they do it? How did Nintendo and companies like Sega, Atari, and Commodore shrink the arcade experience into a box you could fit under your TV? It came down to 3 things: integration, optimization, and brutal compromise. First, integration. Instead of using dozens of separate chips like arcade machines did, home consoles used highly integrated circuits. The NES had a custom CPU that combined the processor, the sound chip, and memory control into a single package. Fewer chips meant less power, less heat, and lower cost. Second, optimization. Every line of code has to be as efficient as possible. Developers had to hand-tune assembly language, the lowest level of programming, to squeeze every ounce of performance out of these machines. And third, compromise. The NES couldn't do everything an arcade machine could. The resolution was lower, the colors were more limited, the sound was simpler, but it was good enough. And good enough in your living room beat perfect at an arcade. Remember those arcade cabinets that drew 100 to 300 watts? The NES drew about 10 watts, 1/10 to 1/30th the power. You could run the NES for 10 hours and use the same amount of electricity as running a 100-watt light bulb for 1 hour. Because unlike arcade owners, families couldn't afford to have machines that heated up their living rooms or spiked their electricity bills. By the end of the 1980s, video games had become permanent. I mean, they weren't a fad that we thought they were. They weren't novelty, they were here to stay. The NES alone sold over 60 million units, the Game Boy over 118 million. An entire generation grew up with controllers in their hands. We had conquered the living room, we had conquered portability, we had shrunk the temple and brought it home. But there was still one frontier left, one impossible dream that haunted every developer, every engineer, every kid staring at a flat 2D screen. What if we could step inside? What if games could have depth? The 1990s would answer that, and the answer would nearly break the machines trying to deliver it. This is the moment everything changed. For over a decade, video games had been flat. You moved left and right, you jumped up or down. The world was a painting that you could walk across. But in the mid-1990s, developers tried something that seemed impossible. They tried to add depth. They tried to create worlds that you could walk into, worlds with perspective, with distance, with geometry, and the machines they were using, they were absolutely not ready for it. The PlayStation 1 launched in 1994 in Japan, 1995 in North America, and it was Sony's first attempt at gaming hardware, and it was itself a gamble. They were going head-to-head with Nintendo and Sega, companies that had been making consoles for over a decade, but Sony had one major advantage. They went all in on 3D, no cartridge, no 2D sprites, just polygons, textures, and CD-ROMs. But the problem, well, PlayStation's GPU didn't have a critical piece of technology: floating point math for geometry calculations. The result was that iconic PS1 jitter, textures wobbling, edges shaking, geometry that looks like it's vibrating. It wasn't a bug, it was a limitation, and it gave every PS1 game that unmistakable, slightly unstable look. Now, here's where developers got clever. The PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 both had a serious problem. They couldn't render distant objects without the frame rate collapsing. If you tried to show an entire city block, the console would just grind to a halt. So what did they do? They cheated. In Silent Hill, that thick fog, that's not just atmosphere, that's a technical limitation turned into an artistic choice. The fog hides the fact that the game can only render about 20 feet in front of you, and beyond that, the world literally just doesn't exist yet. It's being loaded in as you walk. Same with Turok: Dinosaur Hunter on the 64. That game was infamous for its fog. People joked about it, but without it, the game couldn't run. The fog was covering for the fact that the Nintendo 64 couldn't draw more than a dozen polygons in the distance without dropping to 15 frames per second. But the fog wasn't the only trick. Developers also used something called MIP mapping, and here's how it works. Imagine you're looking at a brick wall up close. The texture needs to be sharp, detailed, high resolution, but if that same wall is 100 feet away, it's only taking up a few pixels on your screen. Rendering a full high-res texture would be a waste of processing power. So instead, developers created multiple versions of the same texture at different resolutions. As an object moved further away, the game will swap to a 256 by 256 pixel texture, then smaller and smaller, and so on and so on. This saved a massive amount of VRAM, video memory, and VRAM at the time was precious. The PlayStation 1 had about 2 megabytes of RAM and 1 megabyte of VRAM. Just for context, a single 1080p image would take up like 6 megabytes today. Yeah, they weren't really using much. The mid-90s became a war between two philosophies. Sony and PlayStation had two different things. Sony had CDs that hold 600 to 700 megabytes. That's why PS1 games had full motion video cutscenes, orchestra soundtracks, and enormous worlds, whereas Nintendo 64 used cartridges that were a bit expensive, but they were fast. Cartridges had basically no load time. You could swap between levels instantly, but you were limited. Most N64 cartridges maxed out at only 32 megabytes, and the larger ones were prohibitively expensive to manufacture. So the result was that PlayStation had quantity, the N64 had speed, and in terms of raw polygon pushing power, the Nintendo 64 actually had the edge. It could render more polygons per second than the PlayStation 1, but because of those tiny cartridges, developers couldn't store high-resolution textures, so the Nintendo 64 games looked cleaner, but often blurrier. Let's talk about polygons. Polygons are the building blocks of 3D graphics. In the late 80s, arcade games like Hard and Drive featured cars made of maybe 200 to 300 polygons. They looked like origami. By 1997, characters in Final Fantasy VII had about 500 to 700 polygons in gameplay, and up to 1,500 polygons in their cutscenes. And for comparison, a single character in a modern video game like The Last of Us Part 2 has over 200,000 polygons. We're talking about a 1,000-fold increase in geometric complexity. The 1990s gave us depth. They gave us worlds we could step into, explore, get lost in, but those worlds came at a cost. The textures wobbled, the fog was thick. The polygons were clunky. Frame rates dropped. The hardware was being pushed too far beyond what it was designed to do. And yet, we didn't care. Because for the first time, we could walk around something. We could rotate the camera. We could look up at the sky and down at the ground. The 90s taught us how to cheat, how to hide limitations, how to turn technical constraints into artistic choices. It's 2004, and what you're looking at shouldn't be possible. The PlayStation Portable. The PSP was Sony's attempt to do something no one had successfully done before. Put console quality graphics in a handheld device that you could fit into your pocket. The Game Boy had proven that portable games could be profitable, but the Game Boy was simple. It was monochromatic at first, limited color later, 2D sprites, low resolution. The PSP was different. It had a 4.3-inch backlit LCD screen capable of displaying 480 by 272 pixels, which was higher resolution than most TVs at the time were using. It could push 33 million polygons per second. It had stereo speakers, Wi-Fi, whatever that is, and could play movies, music, photos, TV shows. It was essentially a portable PlayStation 2, and to make it work, Sony's engineers had to become masters at compression. Here's the problem. The PSP used a proprietary format called UMD, Universal Media Disc. The tiny disc could only hold about 1.8 gigabytes of data. For comparison, a standard PlayStation 2 game on a DVD held about 4.7 gigabytes on a single layer disc, or 8.5 gigabytes for dual layer discs. So developers had to take games that were designed for 4 to 8 gigabytes and cram them onto a disc that held 1.8 gigabytes of space, while still maintaining visual fidelity that looked next gen for a handheld. So how did they do it? Simple answer: compression. Brutal, aggressive, yet masterful compression. Let's start with audio. On the PlayStation 2, game soundtracks and voice acting were often stored as high-quality audio files, sometimes uncompressed or maybe lightly compressed. So that obviously was the first thing to go. Everything was compressed to hell. Music was encoded at lower bit rates, voice lines were compressed, sometimes heavily. Sound effects were reused wherever possible. A single minute of CD quality stereo audio takes up about 10 megabytes. If you can compress that to a lower bit rate, you can get that to under 1 megabyte. That's a 10-to-1 compression ratio, and across the entire game with hours of music and dialogue, that saved hundreds of megabytes. What do we do next? Audio was just the beginning. The real data hog was those textures, the images wrapped around 3D models to give them detail. A full color texture in 24-bit RGB uses 3 bytes per pixel. So instead of storing every single color code, they would just make a reference table or a lookup table that the game would look up the color, say color number 12, pull that in, and make it simple like that. There was also asset stripping. If the player is never going to see something, why store it? Why render it? In portable versions of games, developers would literally delete the backs of faces, the backs of buildings, the underside of vehicles, the interiors of object a player couldn't access. Every polygon costs memory. Every texture costs storage. If you can prove the player will never see it, you can cut it. This is why some PSP games had invisible walls or restricted camera angles. They weren't just design choices, they were necessary to hide the fact that half the world literally didn't exist. And then there was the most infamous trick of them all: the hidden loading screens. You've experienced this thousands of times without probably ever really realizing it. Have you ever wondered why so many games in the 2000s had these long elevator rides or really tight crevices that your character had to squeeze through, or maybe a slow opening door that you had to spam X so your character can push the door open? Those aren't artistic choices, those are loading screens. While you're riding the elevator in Mass Effect, the game is deleting the previous level from RAM and streaming in the next one. While you're squeezing through that crack in the wall in Uncharted, the game is desperately loading textures, models, and scripts for the upcoming area. The PSP had 32 megabytes of RAM. The PlayStation 2 also had 32 megabytes of RAM, but these machines couldn't store entire games in memory at once. They had to constantly swap in and out data from the UMD or from the DVD. The disk read speeds were like really slow. A UMD drive could read about 11 megabits per second is very slow. So to load like 10 megabytes of data, you needed about 7 seconds, hence the elevator ride. But I mean, despite all these constraints, the PSP was a miracle of engineering. Games like God of War, Grand Theft Auto, Liberty City, Metal Gear Solid looked absolutely stunning. They felt like console games because, well, they were. GTA fit an entire open world city, cars, pedestrians, buildings, missions, radio stations into 1.2 megabytes. For comparison, GTA San Andreas on the PlayStation 2 used about 4.5 gigabytes. They did it through relentless optimization, compressed textures, lower resolution models in the distance, aggressive asset streaming, and smart reuse of data. So by the mid-2000s, we weren't just building games, we were building illusions. We were using normal mapping to make flat walls look like they had 3D bricks. We were using occlusion culling to technique where the computer literally stops rendering everything behind the camera. If you could turn your head fast enough, you might be able to see the void. Like the world only exists because the computer is fast enough to build it in the moment you look at it. We have reached a point where optimization wasn't just a technical necessity, it was an art form. Developers were like magicians, hiding the seams, masking the limits, turning constraints into strengths. By all of this, the compression, the streaming, the hidden loading screens was about to come obsolete because the next decade wouldn't be about doing more with less. It would be about having so much power that the question became, what do you even do with all this? Now, this is the moment we killed the jagged edge, the leap from the PlayStation 2 to the PlayStation 3, from the original Xbox to the Xbox 360. It wasn't just about more power, it was about resolution. I mean, for decades, most people played games on a standard definition CRT TV, which was like 480i resolution. Then there came this amazing thing called high definition, which started at 720p and almost a million pixels. That's 3 times as many pixels to render. Every frame 30 times per second at this point. And if you want 1080p, that is over 2 million pixels, which is 7 times more than standard definition. This wasn't just a visual upgrade, it was a fundamental rethinking of how much data needed to move through the system. The 2000s console wars was defined by 2 wildly different philosophies of power. Microsoft's Xbox 360 used a chip called the Xenon, which had 3 identical CPU cores, each running at 3.2 gigahertz. Simple, right? Symmetrical, developer friendly. If you knew how to code for one core, you knew how to code for all 3. Sony's PlayStation 3 used a cell processor, and it was a monster. 1 main power PC core and 7 specialized co-processors called SPEs. It was asymmetric, complicated, and notoriously difficult to program. But here's the difference, right? The Xbox 360 was like having 3 different chefs in the kitchen, all doing the same task, whereas the PlayStation 3 was like having 1 head chef and 7 assistants, each with very specific jobs. If you could coordinate them perfectly, the PS3 could do things the Xbox 360 couldn't dream of. But if you didn't know what you were doing, it was a nightmare. And this is why multi-platform games like Midnight Club Los Angeles often ran better on the Xbox 360. Developers had limited time and budgets. The 360 was easier to optimize for, but first-party Sony studios like Naughty Dog, I mean, they mastered cell no problem. The Last of Us on PlayStation 3 is still one of the most technically impressive games ever made on that hardware. But the real breakthrough of the generation wasn't the CPU, it was the GPU. Specifically unified shaders. Now, before the Xbox 360, graphics chips were divided into 2 types of processors. You had vertex shaders and pixel shaders. I'm not going to get into all the specifics, but vertex shaders basically handled the geometry, the shape of 3D objects, and pixel shaders handled the color, the texture, the lighting. Now, let me tell you why, once again, Midnight Club LA was just like such a huge aha moment. It ran on the same engine as Grand Theft Auto 4, the Rage engine, and it did something revolutionary. It had global illumination, which basically just tells you how light affects when maybe it hits a car in the real world. Some of that light bounces bounces off and spreads some of that red tint, just basically making the light as realistic as possible. Most games fake this with like pre-calculated lighting, but Rage calculated it dynamically. I guess it's kind of like ray tracing before ray tracing was a thing, but this is why Los Angeles at sunset and Midnight Club look just so real. I mean, the light wasn't just painted on, it was simulated. That asphalt absorbed the reflected light, the car paint shimmered, the buildings cast realistic shadows that changed as you drove, and the draw distance, I mean, that game used an aggressive LOD system, which is level of detail. In the distance, buildings were simple, low polygon boxes, but as you got closer, the game swapped them for more detailed models, and GTA 5 also used this same thing. You can see the entire city from a hilltop, then zoom down to street level and read license plate, all without a loading screen. To get all this level of detail and immersion within a video game, it required a lot of space. The Xbox 360 used dual layer DVDs, which held about 8.5 gigabytes. The PlayStation 3 used Blu-ray discs, which could hold 25 to 50 gigabytes. But if you're comparing that to the 90s, a game like Final Fantasy VII that fit on 3 CDs totaling 1.3 gigabytes, a single PlayStation 3 game could be 20 times larger than a game in the 90s. And even with that much space, developers were running out of room. I mean, high resolution textures, uncompressed audio, motion capture animation, it was all adding up. So now we've arrived at the present. We started at arcades and here we are today. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We've kind of hit a wall with games in 2026. I mean, they can look photorealistic, not stylized realistic, not good for a video game, like actually photorealistic. Modern GPUs can simulate ray tracing, the actual physical behavior of light, every photon, every reflection, every shadow. To run a game like Cyberpunk 2077 with full ray tracing at 4K resolution, your computer is performing trillions of floating operations per second. Once again, the Apollo 11 guidance computer, it handled about 0.00004 teraflops. A modern RTX 4090 GPU has over 80 million teraflops. That's 2 million times more powerful. We're now simulating the universe. We're calculating physics that you just can't see. The way air temperature affects tire friction, the way dust particles scatter light, the way sound waves bounce off different materials. But here's the problem. Once you hit photorealism, where do you go? Now, I'm sure they said the same thing in the 90s. Oh my goodness, I can't imagine video games looking much better than this. But I mean, really, we've reached the point of diminishing returns. Doubling the processing power no longer doubles how good a game looks to the human eye. Going from 300 polygons to 100,000 polygons, that's transformative. The difference is day and night, but going from 200,000 to 400,000, most people really can't tell the difference. And the same thing goes for frame rates. Most people probably can't see from 60 to 100 frames per second. I can, but some people can't. The jump from 720p to 4K is noticeable, but the jump from 4K to 8K, you need to sit like 2 feet from a massive screen to really see the difference. We're now at a point where improving graphics means simulating things that are imperceptible, and that's incredibly expensive. Not just in processing power, but in development time and human labor itself. And here's where the realism trap becomes a crisis. Modern AAA games can take 5 to 7 years to develop and cost $100 to $300 million. Some have exceeded over $500 million. Why? Because a single environment artist might spend 3 days modeling one tree. A character artist might spend weeks on a face. A lighting artist might spend months tweaking how light bounces in a single room. We're finally winning the war against the pixel, but we're losing the war against the budget. Game files have exploded. Have you tried playing like any Call of Duty? It's 300 gigabytes minimum because you have to use Call of Duty HQ, but that's a whole nother video. But just comparing that to Super Mario Brothers, like, it's crazy how far we've come. While Sony and Microsoft were chasing photorealism, Nintendo took a different path. The Nintendo Switch is running on a 2015 era mobile hardware. The NVIDIA Tegra X1 chip, which was designed for tablets, is significantly less powerful than a PS4, let alone a PS5. And yet, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is one of the most visually stunning games of the generation because Nintendo realized something crucial. Art style is timeless. Realism ages. A photorealistic game from 2015 looks dated today. Wind Waker from 2002 still looks beautiful because it wasn't trying to be real. It was trying to be expressive. It was trying to be art. Tears of the Kingdom uses some of the same tricks developers have been using since the 90s, but perfected. Distant trees aren't 3D models, they're billboards, flat 2D images that always face the camera. You don't notice they're fake until you get close, which at some point the game swaps them in for 3D models. Game also uses dynamic resolution scaling. When the action gets intense or the camera moves quickly, the resolution instantly drops from 900p to 720p or maybe even lower, like 480. And it works because the art style is cohesive enough that the human brain stops looking for technical flaws. We've come a long way from the oscilloscope. We've moved from 8 bits to 64, from kilobytes to almost terabytes now, from 2 megahertz to 5 gigahertz, from 300 polygons to 200,000, from monochrome to 16 million colors in HDR 4K. We taught rocks, silicon wafers etched with billions of microscopic switches, how to calculate the speed of light, how to simulate physics, how to render worlds that feel real. But maybe the lesson in the last 70 years isn't that graphics need to be real. Maybe it's that the best graphics are the ones that serve the game. Because while photorealism will eventually hit a wall, like it probably has, art doesn't really have a ceiling. We spent decades trying to make games look like reality. And congratulations, we succeeded. We can now simulate reflections, refractions, subsurface scattering, global illumination. We can render individual strands of hair, realistic fabric physics, photorealistic faces. But the games that endure, the ones that people remember decades later, they're not always the most realistic. They're the ones with the most soul, with vision, with cohesive art direction that transcends technical limitations. Crazy. It all started with a single dot of light on a screen in 1958. And no matter how many billions of polygons we add, how many trillions of calculations we perform, how many terabytes of data we stream, it's still just us staring at the light. The question was never, how real can we make it? The question was always, how do we make it feel?